Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
Survival was the rule of the day.
My jaw was broken. I could feel my molars in the centre of
We
my
weren't out there
mouth.
to take country. We were out there
At the end of the day, everyone
That was our job.
wearing green is a soldier.
We've lost communication.
Getting yourself blown up does some interesting things to you.
A place like the Middle East is constantly
There's
changing.
quite enough pressure
What
when
we
you
do there is
deploy and
constantly
everything.
changing.
We killed Dave.
And this, the thing was our own minefield. He held me up with a broken whiskey bottle and machete.
Battle for Australia.
For today's bonus episode of Life on the Line, I spoke over Skype not with a war veteran, but a veteran of writing about them. Michael Veitch is a well-known author, actor, comedian, and former ABC TV and radio presenter. His publishing bibliography includes an impressive list of books about Australian pilots who fought in World War II. Among others, he's the author of FLAK, Fly, Heroes of the Skies, 44 Days, and out now is his new book, BARNEY GREATREX. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Thank you very much, Alex. Nice to be here.
So, Michael, your interest in World War II history, in particular World War II aviation, when did that start and where did it come from?
Nowhere where you'd think. I don't have a military tradition in my family. Well, having said that, my granddad actually had a pretty active war in the Navy in World War II. He was in Darwin for almost the entire length of the Pacific War, saw every air raid of Darwin ever had, including the big one in February, lost a lot of his friends, and then he was on minesweepers based out of Darwin. But I didn't really know him. He died when I was very young, and my father didn't even know much about what his father had done, which is quite odd as well. Dad himself was too young for the Second World War. I think my interest just came around from making model planes as a kid. I'm not an only child, but I thought I grew up as one because my siblings are all much older than me, and they, kids left home back in the 60s, as opposed to what they do now is hang around and annoy their parents until their parents are 70 years old. So I sort of grew up by myself, and before the age of screens, I think kids had more interesting hobbies than they do now, and I just started making planes, the Airfix and Revell and the Frog planes, and from that I just became interested in the stories and the history. And of course, when I was that age, the people who had flown them were still in abundance and relatively younger than I am now, which is pretty bloody scary, I can tell you. And I developed a knack of sort of talking to them about what they'd done in the war at a time when nobody was really interested in the experiences of Australian aviators in World War II, or all aviators in World War II. And it's sort of an interest that grew from there, and it's remained all my life now. I guess more mature people grow out of these childhood habits. Not me. I've just kept it rolling on into old age.
Turned it into a career as well.
Indeed, yeah.
So you're interested in both the personal stories of the men and the aircraft themselves, the different kinds?
Yes. Basically, particularly, I used to love reading first-hand accounts because really, a first-hand account is the ultimate primary source. And there was something about actually speaking to the people who actually went through it and sort of looking into their eyes and thinking, my God, those eyes actually saw all this extraordinary detail in living colour in their youth, because we tend to think of that area as a black and white world because of the film footage, although so much colour is now coming out on YouTube and Facebook and that for these interested groups. But knowing that it was, when I used to speak to these blokes about what they'd gone through, I saw it myself in colour as opposed to the black and white images on the television. So I found it very vivid and continued to do so.
So the history was a passion for you and obviously a major part of your career now, but it was not your first career.
No, I sort of stumbled into performing because it was the only thing I was really good at school. Or wagging, I was good at that. I could write. I was good at English, but that's about all. And history when I applied myself, which I never really did.
But you had a writing flair early on as well. Your breakout to fame was Degeneration, a show you co-created, co-wrote.
Yes, yes. So stumbled into performance at school and then at university. And to cut a long story short, I went to Melbourne University and did an arts degree, and we did reviews, sort of university reviews. And one was a couple back in the day in the 80s were particularly good, and they toured nationally as a show in their own right. And the ABC saw us and picked us up and said, look, we're actually looking for a homegrown sketch comedy series. Do you want to have a crack, do a pilot? We did a pilot and got the job, and that became the Degeneration in the mid-80s. We did 2 seasons of Degeneration, the second of which has been lost. It's very hard to find a copy of that second season of Degeneration, and it was really good too. And then Fast Forward happened after that, and then I did a bit of Full Frontal, and then just sort of varied out into writing and stage stuff now. So that's what I've been doing more or less on and off ever since.
And that original crew on the Degeneration, that was made up of quite famous Australian greats.
Oh yeah, they're all the working dog people now. They're all the people who brought us the Castle and the Dish and Frontline and all those amazing things. There was this ocean of sketch comedy. It was very popular, but the comedy company was winding down. They'd started in the mid-80s, and we sort of got going on 7 in the late 80s. So, and we pinched a few people. Glenn Robbins came over from Comedy Company, and I think a couple of other people came and went too. But it was this sort of this melting pot of Melbourne sketch-based writer-comedian performers. Really, they were good. They were good days. It was great fun to be involved with, and it was very hard work. And we didn't even realise the success of it at the time because we had to do it. It was churning out, an hour of sketch comedy a week. Is absolutely brutal, week after week, and we were exhausted by the end of it. But it was good, and people still remember it very fondly, I have to say, which warms the cockles of my heart, because I look back at it like it's a different life, really, because, time moves on and you're not the same person, really, as you are in your youth. Well, you are, but you're not. And I look at it with a kind of fondness of my early career.
Well, at the time, were you feeling any kind of pull towards print? Your parents were journalists.
Oh, yeah. No, well, absolutely. Both my mother and father and my uncle have always been writers. Mum was a writer on the Women's Weekly during the war. And in a bizarre coincidence, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but in a bizarre coincidence, she and I interviewed the same Spitfire pilot.
Oh, wow. She,
while he was doing it, and myself many decades later, and he was I think he was a 451 Squadron pilot up in the islands, operating out of Darwin. Mum had this column where she'd interview servicemen in 1943, 44, 45, and for the girls at home to meet these gorgeous young handsome men flying and sailing and in the army as well. And she had a little column where she interviewed them, and one of them was interviewed by Mum when he was 20, and I got him when he was about 90. How about that?
Did you know that going into the interview?
No, I only realised it sadly after he died, because I saw Mum's clipping book after Mum died as well. I realized, oh my God, I did him in I think the second book, Fly. I can't recall his name actually either, but he's no longer with us either. But it's a shame. Shame I didn't remember it at the time, or didn't know, wasn't aware of it. That would have been interesting to bring up, but time was against us.
It's a hard connection to make as well, going in not knowing already.
Indeed.
Before we get to your writing career, you didn't just jump straight from TV to that. You had many careers going at once, musicals, radio, TV, on the ABC. It's pretty diverse.
Oh, I'm a man of many bills, Alex, and I've got to pay them all. I don't like standing still for long. I've got a fairly low boredom threshold, I think. Yes, well, I've sort of diversed into... I was a theatre critic for a while with 3 newspapers, actually, the Herald, Sun, Australian and The Age. I stopped doing it because I kept pulling my punches. I sort of lost my bottle. I couldn't keep saying bad things about people I knew who were doing their best on stage, so I actually gave that up. I did some column writing for a while. I had a little column with the Qantas In-Flight magazine, all those sorts of things. But I always sort of knew I'd go into writing. And I was at the ABC for a few years, broadcasting on the radio across Victoria occasionally, but I had a permanent gig in Tasmania broadcasting across ABC 936 Hobart. But the books came out because a friend of mine was writing the biography of Bud Tingwell, the actor, the much-loved actor, who was also a photo reconnaissance pilot. And when it came to Peter Wilmoth writing Bud's war chapter, he kept ringing me up and saying, look, can you translate some of this technical stuff that Bud's telling me because I don't understand it? And as I was explaining to Peter, I just had this notion that I should do my own book and just go around and chat to these guys. And because, often people don't understand what they did, but I do a bit because I understand this stuff. So that was it, and that became an embarrassingly easy process. It was basically sealed in a day. An hour later, I rang the publisher of my friend Peter Wilmoth's book and said, look, I've got this idea. And he said, that sounds good. Give us 400 words. So I just bashed them out to him then and then. And he ran back and said, yeah, that sounds great. We've got as it happens, we have a editors meeting 2 days' time. I'll give you a ring. And that was it. 2 days later, I had a contract. So that was my first foray into it. I did 2 more books of interviews. It was just basically tracking down former airmen. I wasn't fussy. I don't care if they'd been pilots or gunners or bombers or fighters or anything, really. I actually wanted more diversity, and I tried to interview everybody that contacted me or that was contacted on their behalf. And I tried to get to them all, and I wrote up virtually every interview I did. The mantra was that every man who flew during the Second World War has at least one extraordinary story, usually more. I even turned it into a stage show called FLAK, which is still touring. We did a big tour of Australia 2 years ago, and we got some more dates just this week, actually, where I actually become 5 of these guys on stage telling their story with my younger self sort of weaving in and out of the middle of it. But that's been a great thing to do as well. It's always because almost all the fellows that I do are now dead.
So you get a real creative synergy there with your drama TV days and acting out these stories you've documented.
Very much so. I mean, it's a kind of combination of all the things I do, sort of writing and researching and performing. It's been great. Although I realised one of the fellows whose story was quite extraordinary, a man called Dudley Marrows, DSO, DFC, Sunderland pilot with 461 Squadron in Coastal Command, sunk a German U-boat and dropped a dinghy to the survivors in a spontaneous act of compassion, 14 of which survived out of a crew of nearly 70. And they later formed the Survivors of U461 Association. And his wife contacted them in the 60s. And then he befriended the surviving captain, who then visited Australia, and they became friends for life. And Dudley's alive still. He's 100 years old. And I actually saw him when I did a performance of FLAK, which is what the show's called, at Lake Boga a few months ago. And I'm actually in contact with his daughter to come up. He's 99. He's 100 in about a month. And I'm going up to celebrate his centenary. That's been a wonderful experience, reconnecting with Dudley.
That's amazing. Have you had many veterans, or more likely their family members, see the show and your reenactment?
The family members have only 2. A guy called Bruce Clifton has come to see it twice. So they're the only 2 surviving, I think, from the people that I do on stage. Bruce was a Lancaster pilot whose aircraft exploded and he was blown out of it, survived without a scratch, and was the only surviving. He was the only survivor, and he was the pilot too, which is remarkable. And he survived because he'd lost control of the aircraft because FLAK had knocked out his intercom. So he was getting up from the cockpit to tell the rest of the crew, sort of manually, to bail out. And because he wasn't strapped in at the time when the aircraft exploded, the bomb load went off, he said, I was just expelled like a pip squeezed out of an orange. The whole thing just went whoosh and I went with it. But I didn't hit anything. I was just sort of forced through the air by the blast. But I just got a tiny little scratch above my nose and came down in one piece, and I was in no pain, and it was just bizarre. And that's his story. And he's still alive today. Lives near Bacchus Marsh in central Victoria somewhere.
And the stories you're pulling together for FLAK, Fly, Heroes of the Skies, they're
Australian fighter pilots, bombers, etc., from Bomber Command, Pacific War, all over the theatre.
Yes, absolutely. No, as I said, I wasn't fussy at all. It's a way of, it started almost as a kind of a voyeuristic, almost sort of storytelling episode. But then I started to realise that I was the only person sometimes that these people had told these memories to. So the responsibility then became enormous, and I started to feel it. And it was like, God, I'm holding these persons' memories, these extraordinary memories from the kind of trial of war of these people's youth. So that's why I wanted to keep doing more books and end up doing 3, because often it's the only record, literally the only record of these men's war, of what they did in their youth. Because so many times the families have read the stories and said, we had no idea about this. He didn't tell anyone, and frankly, we weren't interested, we confess, but they told you, and it's absolutely astonishing. We didn't know he went through this. So then it became, wow, this is more than just gathering stories. This is really quite important for myself and for the people concerned.
But then you narrowed that focus last year with 44 Days.
Yes, well, this was an interesting experience because Hash had asked me if I was interested in telling the story of the 44 Days, and I said, sorry, what story? Like most Australians, I don't know about this amazing tale from the very early part of the Pacific War, where there was one single squadron that had been very hurriedly scratched together at the last minute to defend Moresby against the rampaging Japanese air power that was softening it up for invasion. And so I agreed to take on this job, and it became a different kind of book in that it was the first one I didn't actually get the chance to speak to the men concerned. However, halfway through the research period, I discovered that virtually all the main pilots that I'd been writing about had in fact left these recordings and interviews they'd done in the 1980s with the Canberra War Memorial, and some were online. Some I had to go up for to listen to the cassettes, but it was like these men whose stories I'd been relating from primary and secondary sources were suddenly alive because I could hear their voices talking about it really lucidly and really interestingly. It was a similar kind of path, if you like, even though they're no longer with us. But the story is remarkable. I mean, if there was ever a David and Goliath story of this one squadron flying sort of borrowed Kitty Hawk fighters that just by a stroke of luck had fallen into our lap because the whole shipload had been diverted from the Dutch who'd already lost the game up in Borneo. And so this shipload of these modern fighter planes kept going south and ended up in Botany Bay, and at which point the Australian government said, oh, we'll have them, thank you very much, send us the bill. And they bolted them together at Bankstown Airport, and it was the nucleus of 3 new fighter squadrons, one of which, 75, was sent immediately into battle with very little training to defend Port Moresby against Japanese air attacks that were coming over the hump of the Owen Stanley Ranges from Lae and Salamaua on the north coast. And so for 6 weeks, these blokes just went up and just blasted away in aircraft that were not suited to dogfight the Japanese fighters, the Zeros, but gave a wonderful account of themselves in a battle that could never be won, but they certainly, it was the first time the Japanese had actually experienced any resistance to their onslaught, that everybody saw as being irresistible at that stage of the war because they hadn't been checked. This is March 1942, 5 or so months after Pearl Harbor, where they were still on this amazing blitz of Southeast Asia that I think eclipses just about anything even the Germans were doing in Europe. I mean, they moved so fast and with such brutality and with such coordination and speed that everybody was overwhelmed. And so finally they reached the absolute end of their lines, which is basically Port Moresby, which they tried to get, as we know, with the Kokoda battle later that year. But earlier than that was the air war of Moresby and Kokoda, which is what the 44 Days book is about.
Because you weren't engaging live with the subjects, do you think that gave your writing more objectivity because you were dealing with the sources?
Well, yes, it certainly did. I had to use a lot more sources. And, but as I said, the discovery of those tape recordings gave me an ability to actually quote actual things that these fellows had said, which gives it a kind of a life that I wouldn't have had otherwise, which has been great. And when these people have written their own stories, helps enormously. As I'll not jumping ahead to the Barney Greatrex book, but the fact that Barney himself wrote something and did an interview for a writer gives it so much more scope and so much more life, because you can actually give a first-person voice to the story you're telling.
Of course. This next one's half literary review, half question. To my mind, your books all tackle the historical, political, and social contexts relevant to the personal stories that you're telling. But
crikey, really? Bloody hell.
But when you get to the heart of a story...
I'll take that as a compliment. Go on, sorry.
But when you get to the heart of a story, the characters, the adventure, the thrills, the terror, the action, I find your writing very cinematic, descriptive, fast, full of emotion. So my question is, after that review, do you think your performance background has shaped your writing in any way?
I think it probably has. That's a very good observation. But I think I hate dry writing, and also I really believe writing at its best is a visual medium, because you're putting pictures in people's heads. So if you're not doing that, I don't think you're writing properly, especially with describing history, because history is events, and events are full of colour and movement. And if you're not getting that, I don't think you're getting the history. So I'm not an historian, I'm a storyteller, happy to be so. And to tell a good story, I think you have to work with the visual aspect of what you're doing. And I always try to do that when I can.
Now, before we go on to your next book, I should disclose for the listeners that I actually worked on your next book.
Indeed, a very vital part of it too.
Thank you, you're too kind. So your next book is Barney Greatrex, about World War II veteran Barney Greatrex. Barney was one of 12 men profiled in a documentary miniseries I directed called For School and Country. And myself and the rest of the team behind that doco, we knew Barney's story had to be told beyond it. And we have since been very fortunate to work with yourself and the publisher on this book, which I'd like to talk about with you now.
Sure. Well, that's absolutely correct. Barney, who's an old boy of your school, was many years before you went there, though, of course, was a young, ordinary young man, really, from the suburb of Sydney, who, like thousands others, joined the Air Force in the beginning of the Second World War, broke off his studies and just joined the pool of the Empire Air Training Scheme, and elected, strangely enough, to be a bomb aimer and not a pilot. They all wanted to be pilots, but Barney was happy to be a bomb aimer. So he trained as such, as an observer and all sorts of things, did a bit of gunnery, and was sent into Bomber Command and was sent to 61 Squadron, beginning his tour of 30 operations towards the end of 1943, just in time for the what they called an infamous series of air raids on the German capital, Berlin, conducted insanely in the winter of 43-44, where they decided for the first time really to attack Berlin and to try and bomb it. Arthur Harris, who was the head of Bomber Command, said, "I can win you the war if you give me a free hand and all the resources I need to attack the German capital, and I'll wreck it end to end," he claimed. Because he'd been claiming all sorts of things for 2 years. He'd been claiming that he could win the war by bombing alone, and he obviously had not been doing that. So he said, "Well, you haven't been giving me enough resources or enough planes. You give me what I want, and I'll be able to do it." Of course, he didn't, because he was something of a megalomaniac, Harris. It cost him 1,000 Lancaster bombers to do it. 1,000 roughly was shot down during this campaign, and for no real gain. Not really. It's hard to say what the point of the Battle of Berlin was, just except to smash up a few of the Berlin suburbs and kill a great number of its civilian inhabitants. There wasn't much military industry in Berlin. It was a long way to go. Berlin is towards the east of Germany, away from the big industrial centres of the Ruhr, which are towards the west of Germany. But he was given a free hand to do it under appalling conditions. Imagine what the middle of a European winter and flying at 20,000 feet. Sometimes the temperatures were plummeting, to minus 30, minus 40 centigrade, and it was very hard to bomb accurately. The weather was atrocious. The aiming apparatus wasn't good enough to overcome it. And so Barney would have spent most of his tour doing these nights after heading to Berlin and not really knowing what he was bombing, because you couldn't. You bombed on the Pathfinder markers, but sometimes the Pathfinder markers couldn't mark what the target was anyway, so they just bombed what they thought was a target and hoped for the best. But he was getting towards the end of his tour, I think his 20th operation out of 30, and it was a trip to Augsburg in February 44, and he was attacked by a night fighter over France, over Nancy, and he was shot down. And it came down virtually on the French-German border. The sole survivor of his aircraft, he managed to get out his own bomb aimer's hatch by a miracle, how he got out of it. He was later questioned, how did you do that? Because the aircraft was in a centrifugal spin. It was in a spin because it had lost power. And he managed to get himself out of it. Came down, witnessed the death of the rest of his 6 crew, and he was a sole survivor and wandered round, and after a couple of days of getting hungry and cold and tired, he decided to make the most fateful decision of his life, was to knock on a door and hope for the best. And that became his adventure, because luckily he chose the right door of this little alpine village, where he was taken in and funneled through the French resistance. Now, for some reason, which I've never been able quite to ascertain, he wasn't put into the rat lines where they tried to smuggle the airmen back to Europe. He was sort of kept by the French resistance, and he sort of worked for them. He was actually given a number. He was given a
salary.
He was given a salary. And so for the next 8 months, he was with his resistance cell, learning French, doing little jobs for them, witnessing a couple of the latter battles of the French resistance that happened around the Vosges Mountains towards the end of the middle and the end of 1944. And he also became involved in one of the Allied-led resistance assistance operations, codenamed Jedburghs. They were highly trained 3-man teams that dropped in to kind of train the often fairly haphazard and chaotic French resistance organisations. And there were many, because the French resistance spent most of the time fighting each other. So, that's actually a little bit unfair. The resistance was really a kind of a replicated French society. It was very divided and very antagonistic unto itself, which is one of the reasons the Germans were able to defeat France so easily in 1940, but that's another story. So these blokes came in speaking French and highly trained and tried to organise the resistance and give them some basic battle training. And Barney became part of them, and he met this British officer and an American officer and became friends with them, and was able to guide them. And he was hidden by several French families who he kept in touch with for the rest of his life. That's another story. And eventually he was liberated after a long engagement by the American forces around the Vosges Mountains of northeastern France, spending a lot of time in hiding as well, because the Germans were all around them. And eventually he sort of made it through to the American lines, where he was taken back and debriefed and told his amazing story to first the Americans, then the Brits, and eventually found his way back to Australia. In fact, he was actually flown back from France to England by Bomber Harris himself, who just sort of wandered past him at an airfield in Belgium and said, what are you doing here? And said, well, sir, I'm waiting to get back to England. Okay, well, come back with me if you like. I've got a spare seat. And he came back and then told his story to virtually no one. Just went back to a life working for his family's engineering company, amongst other things. And was only really until you, Alex, sort of prized the story out of an aging Barney towards the end of his life. I should add that he's still with us, actually, Barney. I mean, he's a very old man now, but he's still living, and he's living in Sydney. But his story has only recently been told, first by yourself and then by me, in this book, which has been a great pleasure to write. It's been wonderful getting into the mind of this fellow and digging out what his remarkable experience in France and in the in Bomber Command was during the World War II.
It's been an amazing journey to watch Barney's story sort of escape beyond the knowledge of his family, of course, and the community back in the Vosges, which he's stayed in touch with. I first met him and interviewed him along with Angus Horden just after his 91st birthday, and now he's a dear 97-year-old. We premiered that documentary when he was 95 in 2015, and now this book's coming out, which he and the family are so excited about, and it's so gratifying to see his face light up when he realizes this is really happening. He's finally having his story told, because like many of the Airmen you referenced earlier and your other books, just didn't talk about it and didn't know if people were interested or weren't sure, and then suddenly we're bringing him along to school events, talking to large assembly crowds, and he's realizing all these young schoolboys are interested, and got an author chasing him down to spend some time with him to work on his book. It's been wonderful to watch this blossom.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure to do it. You know, you sort of write a book like this and you feel like you've done the journey yourself. I mean, writing a book is the strangest experience, writing any book, because, you know, for months and months you have this thing that's basically between you and between your brain and a screen that you're typing on, and then suddenly when it comes out you flip it and you throw what's been a completely private matter out into the outer world, completely invert their thought processes to it being totally introverted, to publicise it where they're completely extroverted about it. But this has been a great one to do, and my journey has been very fulfilling, doing this story, and I'm so glad I had the opportunity to do so. And it's great to know that people will read the book, hopefully, and discover what it was like, what war was like. I mean, there's you know, I try not to pull any punches. I'm pretty severe on the kind of what I believe to have been the complete uselessness of a lot of Bomber Command's efforts during the Second World War. Not entirely, but particularly this period, the Battle of Berlin period, the Berlin raids, which were far more politically motivated than militarily motivated. There was very little tactical point in what they were doing. They just cost a lot of lives, especially in the air, but on the ground also, of course. This business of attacking a civilian population, hoping they were going to throw the towel in. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't have done it. And they would never have done it anyway. It didn't happen in London, and why would it happen over Germany? But I also feel sorry for the airmen who came back from World War II, from Bomber Command, because the great turning against them after the war, I think, was very sad and very unjust. A bit like what the Vietnam fellows had to go through, having had their government, you know, request them to do this operation, and then come back and to be shunned by the same government and the same people that got them over to do it in the first place. Absolutely terrible.
I find Barney's story so interesting and unique for many reasons, but one of them being the diversity of experiences he has. It's comedy, it's grief, it's drama, it's action. In one scene, he's having lunch at a restaurant, and the next table is filled with German officers, and he's in France with one of his couriers and just told, "You're a dumb mute Frenchman, don't say anything and we'll get through this lunch." And then, you know, a few chapters later, he's walking through the dark with these guys trying to pick up a paratrooping American major.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a wonderful story. I think it's that same restaurant. There were Germans in this restaurant because it was in Epinal, I think, which was a significant sort of regional town there. And his guide had left, had seen someone outside to go and have a chat with him. So I'll be back in a minute, just don't cause any attention. Of course, as soon as he goes, the waitress comes up to him and starts saying, "Well, sir, what do you want?" in French. And Barney doesn't speak a word of French. And so he's sort of, at the next table, there's a few feet away, there's a table full of German officers. So if he's stumbling through trying to speak to this French waitress who's getting more and more impatient, saying, "Oh, come on, you know," it's like...
It's just like a scene out of Allo Allo.
It is like a scene out of Allo Allo. And you can imagine the checkered tablecloths, can't you? And
you can.
That's when Frenchmen still wore berets, I think, and waistcoats. And luckily his handler came back in the nick of time to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, he's just a mute Frenchman." How many mute dumb Frenchmen would there have been in World War II? I mean, there must have been so many of these Allied guys who'd been shot down and said, okay, you are now a dumb French mute farmer. And there must have been hundreds of them.
And the Germans never realised.
Yeah, I know, it's extraordinary that they didn't pick it up.
Yeah, and that's contrasted with, and I won't spoil how the scene ends, we'll let readers find out, but that contrasts so starkly with the introduction to the book where Barney's in a hut and he's with his resistance colleagues, and there's another man who's come to the hut and they're working out he's a spy, and Barney's not sure what's going to happen next.
Yes, that's when Barney had that sort of epiphany of like, how the hell what am I doing? Where am I? How did my very ordinary life get to this point where I'm in this absolutely awful situation? You know, there I was a couple of years ago, I was at my desk at Sydney Uni doing engineering, I was doing okay, and suddenly now here I am in the middle of this French forest, in the middle of a war that's not in my country, but what the hell am I doing here? You know that he had that kind of thought going through his head.
And just quickly on writing the book, you had access to a wealth of archive material from the family, the documentary I worked on, close connections to witnesses of the events, descendants of those witnesses, and other primary sources. And you got to spend time with dear old Barney himself and Barney's brother Anthony.
Yes.
Did that range of sources make writing this book a bit of a hybrid experience between, say, FLAK and 44 Days?
Very much so. It's a long form story on one individual's experiences, but I was able to colour it with so many things. I mean, you mentioned, the fact that Barney is alive is so important, but also his brother Anthony, who was also in the Air Force in Australia during World War II. His wonderful sister-in-law Kathy. She was very helpful with the early Greatrex story. But also things like, the wonder of the internet, the report, the Jedburgh report, in which Barney is mentioned several times, is online and is available from the Kew Records office in London, which I was able to access. And there it is, this 20 beautifully written, fool's cap typed pages of Lieutenant Colonel Guy Prendergast, who was leading this mission. He wrote the whole thing up vividly and with such colour and such clarity and detail in that wonderful, well-educated Englishman style. And there's lots of humour in it, a lot of irony, because he kind of despaired at the incompetence a lot of the time of the French resistance, and despairing, and it was like, God, I've been so well trained, I've been so highly trained in French language and weapons training and all my SAS to train these people, but they're all bloody useless. It's like herding cats. They said, I may as well have just arrived here and just sort of said, look, do your best. There's nothing I can do for you, because they were often so undisciplined, the French resistance. Because they were, and rightly so. I mean, they were amateurs. They were boys sort of just wandering up and joining a resistance cell because they wanted to escape the Germans. They hadn't had any military training or military aspirations. It was just, well, that's all I can do now. I'm on the run. I may as well throw my lot in with the resistance and try my luck there. So these people that had to go in and try and train an army, it was an impossible task. But all this is written up in this fabulous report that I managed to find online. But that was one of the unexpectedly diverse sources, as you say, that was afforded me in the writing of this book.
And Barney's story continues to this day, effectively. A couple of highlights just from the last few years. In 2013, his nephew, Charlie Mort, masterminded a fantastic group trip to France. They took Barney, 93-year-old Barney, was flown to France, and they toured the crash site and the mountains and various other key locations. And in 2016, Barney is awarded the Legion of Honor.
Yes, what a wonderful thing. Awarded by the French consulate, I believe. And I know quite a few former Bomber Command Airmen who assisted in liberating France from, this most terrible regime. One of the most, people forget that. Sometimes we think of the Germans as kind of jokes, really, because, after all, they lost and they weren't there for long. But to have your country, and I think someone said to Barney while he was there, look, why are you doing this? And he said, well, You just don't know what it's like when you're having your country invaded by these bullies and thugs and psychopaths. You'll do anything to get rid of them. And so that's why these men have been honoured in their latter years of their life, finally, by the French, and giving them their highest award, because that's what they did. They helped clear them out because they weren't going to go otherwise, that's for sure.
Well, Michael, I'm very proud of the book and the small part I played, but it's your hard work and brilliant writing that have captured this man's remarkable story, and it's out now.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's been lovely talking to you, and thank you for your help as well.
So, Michael, people will see you on the road publicising the new book, but if they want to get in touch online, where can they find you?
Yes, my website, michaelveitch.com.au. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. You can get me that way too. But no, I'm very socially media accessible, and I'd love to have a chat with anyone who wants to contact me.
Well, I recommend everyone does look Michael up on his website and social media. I know he's got a bunch of other exciting projects in the pipeline of various formats, so everyone should check that out. And they should definitely check out his new book, BARNEY GREATREX. It's a cracking read of heroism, adventure, and a healthy dose of luck. Thanks for your time today, Michael.
Thanks, Alex.
If you like this episode, please make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. You can even leave us a rating and review on iTunes to help other people discover the show. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at Life on the Line Podcast and on Twitter at LOTL Pod. You can also check out our website, www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. All our information about our book with Michael is there. You can also check out www.thesschoolandcountry.com. But I can't encourage you enough to check out Michael Veitch's new book. And if you know a veteran serviceman or servicewoman with a story to tell, please get in touch. We would love to have them on the podcast. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget,